So, we have Professor Jann Pasler of the University of California, San Diego, and her paper is titled Epistemologies of Control and the Limits of Knowledge.
Thank you for staying so late, and you're probably exhausted and hungry and everything else. I wanted to first of all thank Michael and Amy, who will probably be back in a few minutes, for the opportunity to explore these questions, and also to say that I'm actually taking this is going to be something different here, but a kind of race perspective on one of the age-old practices of ethnomusicology.
Woohoo!
So there you go. Okay, at the 1889 International Colonial Congress, Gustave Le Bon, who had written on Arab civilization, India, and primitive culture, presented a new foundation for the assertion of Aryan superiority. In his influential book in 1894, The Psychology of Peoples, Le Bon proposed that the soul of a people, that is, its forms of thought, logic, and above all, character, is fixed and homogeneous. Like polygenous, he believed in a separate origin for each human race, and that variations between human populations in their art reflect distinct racial characteristics. In his History of Music, Vétis explained music as an epistemology of race. He tied an investigation of music and musical instruments to a classification of people, and saw the performance of culture as the performance of intelligence and character. The notion of the soul returned later in books by French anthropologists and administrators. Le Bon and his colleagues had bitter enemies, especially among those who espoused monogenism, the idea that all races descended from one. For them, the environment produced racial diversity. Differences were not categorically unbridgeable, and the attempt to assimilate them could contribute to self-improvement. The French were proud of their Latin soul and its capacity for assimilation. After the French premiere of Wagner's Louisville, a journalist wrote, "In listening to Wagner, many French people created for themselves a German soul." Of course, before that he said the Germans could never do that for French music. Anyway, without this, a particularly prepared and acclimatized state of mind, you will have to endure a dosage of boredom that is nothing less than formidable. Another writer made light of this temporary luxury of possessing two souls for music, as if having two pairs of pants, two shoes, two outfits for every season. In The Souls of Black Folk, W. Du Bois took this concept seriously, pointing to two souls, two thoughts, and two unreconciled strivings in those wanting to be both a Negro and an American. If Du Bois's double consciousness arose from, quote, always looking at oneself with the eyes of others, which I think is a really interesting comment, monogenous, in seeking growth through assimilation, looked at others through their own eyes, albeit often with prejudices and agendas. These racial philosophies motivated the study of music, whether to argue for the primitive nature of certain societies or to understand universal traits throughout the globe. In composing The Citizen, I suggested that in challenging Western audiences at the Universal exhibitions with new ontologies of music, non-Western music encouraged composers such as Debussy to rethink the definition of music. In this paper, I am less concerned with what could be learned about ethnicity or race from music than with how music scholars and the general public fail to come to grips with the, you're not supposed to get that yet, sorry, fail to come to grips with the limits of their understanding. To acquire and constitute knowledge, they needed beliefs that were both true and justified, and analytical methods that contained and explained their perceptions. Instead, they could not agree on monogenism or polygenism to explain racial difference. Belief in their own racial superiority cast a shadow on all inquiry. Techniques of comparison led to circular reason and self-authentication. And most important, they failed to recognize their epistemology's inability to address the gulf between the knowable and the unknowable. The limits of this knowledge were long evident in the terms that French writers used to refer to musical instruments. To ground new knowledge on already acquired knowledge, they used the words drum, guitar, violin, or whatever seemed to resemble their Western counterparts to signal racial identity. Or to understanding African cultures. And this is a questionnaire Belgian guy sent to the Congo, you can see, for the categories of violin, which it asks to find this out. But it did have a purpose. Through comparison of these such terms enabled, instruments could be used to suggest the evolutionary state of a culture or migrations. In composing regional monographs in Africa, colonial administrator Henri Labouré advocated including the notation and translation of song. The attempt to possess non-Western music through Western notation brought an even stronger assertion of power than Western names for instruments. If the goal of transcription was to fix what was heard in live performances or on recordings, not only were oral competence and analytical skills necessary, so too was an acknowledgement of their technology's limitations. Which music lent itself to transcription? What were the transcriber's criteria for what could and could not be possessed and known? Tierso in Paris and Hornbostel in Berlin sought to understand race at home and abroad through music. For the purpose of study and analysis, they inevitably concentrated on music whose complexity seemed within their grasp. If Senegalese music, with rhythm as its principal element, had only vague, unfixed themes lacking consistency, and if the sound produced by Dynamite drums seemed like noise that was impossible to notate, not dignified enough to call melodies, Tunisian music was far more accessible. Its melodic formulae lent themselves to formal analysis, though the precise nature of their pitches, what Tierso called indecisive tuning, was impossible to contain and explain. Hornbostel indicated his formal analysis with letters, but here B is a variation of A. To suggest microtones, he added plus signs over the notes and 30-second notes. When it came to rhythmic complexity, Tierso merely noted that it be performed freely, while Hornbostel, slowing down the playback of the phonograph, wrote 6 measures in 3/4 in order to attempt to capture a short melisma that only lasts a few seconds. When the intonation was too steady to be measured. Perhaps because he was not a musician, but a doctor and an amateur linguist, Léon Azoulay faced the unknown more honestly in his transcriptions of 400 wax cylinders that he made during the 1900 Paris exhibition. Like Tierso and Hornbostel, he sought to fix their language, albeit admitting with imperfect notation, for the purpose of studying ethnic groups. Anticipating Marcel Mauss's recommendation by 300 years, he collected information about his interviewees' lives and chose genres that encouraged comparison, such as the biblical story of the prodigal son and love songs. This is their, this is his notion of his love song. He recorded them in local languages, then made what he called non-systematic phonetic transcriptions and French translations. Asking someone from each ethnicity to start with pronouncing syllables allowed him to conceive of phonemes in their terms, though, like those using the violin and the guitar to refer to bowed or plucked string instrument, he relied on his readers' prior knowledge of other languages, such as noted here the reference to the German H as in house. He also concocted unusual phonemes, as we see here, and explained idiosyncrasies in the performance. As he says here in the transcription, the letters in the parentheses indicate that the sound emitted flows between those of the lower and the upper letters. Not bad for an amateur. Occasionally, his wife transcribed music, though with minimal skills. Another love song. acknowledge the gap between the oral and written traditions. Another love song. So you can see he's barely writing it down. I mean, I love this example because it shows how impossible the notation process was. Some performers were even unable to repeat themselves, which is very interesting in the oral tradition because the whole point is not repeating yourself, right? Generating variants in the recordings. And he notes, it was impossible for the phonograph to dictate even approximately what he sang into the phonograph. Couldn't even repeat the same song with the same words. The transcription, thus, could only be used from the phonetic perspective. So he's really being very honest. So this underlined for him the mobility of language, the uniqueness of his voice, and the limitations in his ability to notate it. In Tunisia, the easiest music to notate, to transcribe, was that of the Bay's wind band, with its entirely Western instruments. A reviewer praised Lavage's 1898 of this hymn, of one of these hymns written for the Bay, in specifically colonialist terms. He writes, "Who among us has not suffered from this cacophony? By a variable musical tour de force, the distinguished professor has fixed the rhythm, given it support, and relief by the most cheerful harmony. If this kind of hybridity pleased because it tamed the rhythms and smoothed out the harsh elements of the original, it also served an important political function. It allowed Westerners to, quote, listen to and applaud indigenous traditions without having to encounter them in their, quote, rudimentary forms." Lavage also published transcriptions of Musicological, and here we begin to sense the different function of transcriptions in the colonies, that is, preservation and use. Collaborations with local musicians led to less anxiety of the gap between the Western and Northwestern music, or the oral and the written traditions, and to pragmatic compromises. Here there's a piano, but as in Arabic music, it doubles the monodies of the octave. At the same time, these pieces could be played on Western instruments, notated on the left. That is, the titles, the song interprets, and the tempo indications also appear in Arabic, suggesting that the public for these transcriptions included the Arab population who could play Western music, read Western notation, and afford this luxurious publication. In Algeria, the Répertoire de musique arabe was the fruit of collaboration between Yafil, a Jewish Algerian who collected the tunes and published the volumes, and Rouanet, who directed his work, also collected tunes, transcribed them, and wrote the introductory analyses of the modes used. Like Lavage, Rouanet reduced the accompaniment to doubling of the octave, but added 2 staves for the rhythmic accompaniment of the original under. Tunes were probably chosen to illustrate the modes, pointing to scales resembling those of the Greeks, such as the Maya here, which he says is like the old Phrygian. Rouanet, like Salvador Daniel before him, claimed that Arabic music had its roots in ancient Greece, i.e., common racial origins offered justification for French occupation and colonialism. These transcribers' purpose was to, quote, fix melodies before they disappeared, quote, saving traditions, not so much from the influence of the French as from the influence of Egyptian forms of modernity. With the help of local musicians, they sought out, quote, melodies typical of the race that could serve as models for African musicians in the future. Models. This was important because, in fact, Arab musicians themselves felt that music was little known to Europeans because, quote, we don't have artists of talent and Arabs had no system of notation. So in other words, teaching is hard, and the greatest practitioners were hoarders. They didn't share their traditions. Indeed, Yafiel founded a school to teach Arabic music and used these volumes to teach it. Unconcerned about intonational anomalies, both Yafiel's ensemble and its successor included Western music, and they sometimes rehearsed with the piano. French music ethnographers concurred on the need to collect first and foremost music the medieval Moors brought from Andalusia in Spain. It was important to construct musical identities firmly linked to the distant past, not to the modern present. Alexis Chautin transcribed 2 volumes of Moroccan music. The first reflects the Andalusian music on urban art songs, monodic transcriptions intended for teaching at the Arab music school that he directed and performance by both French and Arab musicians. Here, sensitive to his informant's intonation, he notes that the B flat should be sung between B and B flat. Commentary I did not find in the Algerian and Tunisian volumes. Because dance was so important to the subject of his volume 2, the rural music of the Chloe, Chautin invented ways to notate its choreography. And actually this is really pretty spectacular because everyone else had totally ignored this element. Such volumes played a political role consistent with French notions of the protectorate, protecting and promoting racial distinctions between Arabs and Berbers while using transcriptions to stem the spread of modernity. French administrators claimed that they had contributed, quote, in large measure to the development of Chloe music, and in many ways this was true. Besides transcriptions, they funded recordings, ensembles, films, and broadcasts of this music. By 1939, having done so much, quote, to save its distinctive characteristics and its cultural value, Chautin felt that he could, quote, predict what the future evolution of this art should be. So much for its fixed soul. In 1940, a local composer, Jacques Lemaire, asked for colonial support to collect and make transcriptions of Andalusian music for the Western Orchestra. These would promote the tradition among Westerners and facilitate le rapprochement intellectuel. Local populations would be delighted to hear what Arab singers might produce with Western musicians. Maire's collaborator was none other than the famous tenor Bakhtarsi, assuring its success. Bakhtarsi was the star of Yafiel's ensemble. During the war, such collaborations were meant to strengthen Arab-French relations. In converting one kind of order into another, transcriptions thus represent a creative interpretation of what transcribers heard and chose to embrace or resist in the originals. Obviously, they sacrificed much by clinging to the orderliness of meter and purity of pitch. As negotiations with the materiality of sound and the distinction of cultures, transcriptions make it clear that understanding the other is limited by one's cultural competence, what defied measure and containment in Western terms, and agendas underlying their uses. Transcriptions are thus a fascinating window onto the challenge of understanding and getting beyond racial differences. Thank you. A lot of this comes from my numerous publications that I'm hiding away in places, but if you're interested, that's where it comes from.
Do you have any panel commentary?
I'm thinking about 2 things. The first is this idea of categorization and modernity. It's, it wasn't just cross-cultural, it was intracultural as well.
Absolutely.
We were obsessed as Americans with this, in music. But I'm wondering about the politics when you compare what they were doing to the politics of what someone like Harry Burleigh was doing with the spirituals, and do we have a different idea about it when it is intracultural rather than cross-cultural?
Well, it's true. I mean, this double consciousness that he's talking about. I mean, I think you could address that. You know, if you want, in terms of the spirituals. But the spirituals were very important to the French in the colonies, and to obviously all the Africans that were participating in French culture, such as Senghor, and also to all the people who were involved with missionary music, and the people, Africans writing masses with local tunes. And in 1947, Présence Africaine, which it started, was very much promoting spirituals. Mm-hmm. So the spirituals were seen as really crucial to American music. Jazz obviously had already been there, but the spirituals made it over too. So I think it's interesting. The reason why I'm concentrating on North African is because the transcription process went forward. There were some transcriptions of sub-Saharan African music, but very little. And Tierso did some, but they just threw up their hands at the complexities of it. Mm-hmm. And of course, sub-Saharan Africa they were not settler colonies as the North African, you know, where they were, you know, 100,000 French in Algeria. Mm-hmm. So it is kind of a different situation. Right. But I think it's the same discourse, because the whole issue of transcribing. And you know, what does it mean? So I mean, I worked a lot on what we learn about race through music, but this was about what we don't learn, and about how people, you know, were, and actually the people in Europe, I think, were focused on study. The people in the colonies were focused on getting the stuff played, and it did have an immense impact on how people learned and what they learned. Mm-hmm. So the doubleness, I think they were feeling a kind of doubleness in a way, but not in the directionality of, you know, that Du Bois was talking about, but in the opposite, but still with, you know, through the kind of assimilation. So I was just trying to add something to the conversation, because Du Bois was one of the topics that, you know, we were going to be dealing with. So.
Yeah. We need to hear.
That's a good point. Any commentary?
Oh.
Hi, Jann, thank you for the paper. Question, to what degree do you think, or do you know, these transcriptions in particular, to what degree were they used by Western European composers, French composers in particular, as kind of like maybe found objects or inspiration for a more kind of exotic flair in their music, particularly at this really kind of rich and highly problematic moment of cultural interaction in France in particular?
It's a really good question, but it doesn't have the answer that you expect. The really interesting thing is that all these, you know, settler ethnographers all had composition backgrounds. They could all compose, and they did, which is what they were doing there. They were composing, if you want. They had good ears, and they were competent transcribers, or much more so than the missionaries and that poor, pathetic Azoulay's wife thing. I mean, you know, that was pretty bad. The women, of course, themselves did. The interesting thing, I know they were distributed in Europe, because I found letters in the Museum of Instruments in Brussels that Lavage was kind of like asking for advanced subscription money and such, and they paid for it because he was the publisher. But I have not seen any examples of Western music that took the tunes from it. I saw them performed later, especially in the 40s, you know, early, the war period in the 40s. A lot of collaborative performances, and they were more used, they wanted the local populations. It was really for the local populations. And again, the threat of the Oriental music from Egypt and Turkey, which is coming, really sort of invasions, if you want, of lots of recordings with a very different sense of modernity. So my sort of, what I've been gathering from this is that this is about cementing a certain kind of identity for them. And then, of course, they did take on, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning, actually. They did take on this Andalusian thing as their own eventually. But my paper tomorrow's how is deconstructing the French role, which is really, I think, formative. It's really kind of an invented tradition. And it starts with these things, but they're not just done by, like Tierso on his own. There are, local musicians who they're working with and who they give names to. Yafiel is Jewish, and Andalusian is a Jewish, Arabic formation. So it's complicated. And Yafiel has Western instruments in his group. It's all it's kind of a new modernity that is based on a certain past. But your answer, the question about did people like Ravel use it? No, Ravel's piece in Chanson Maricas is from the 18th century. So they didn't, interestingly enough. I think it was in a different mode for them, yeah.
I have a really short question, Jann. Thank you for the paper. It's about cosmopolitanism and to what extent, I just wanted to draw a thread through some of the talks, which is to go back to Du Bois and the question of double consciousness. A lot of what is confronted with philosophies of race in relationship to music is a problem of a kind of battle of ideological spheres, of self-consciousness, of healing self and other that Du Bois is dealing with and reconfiguring. And Du Bois, one of the most powerful metaphors is the veil that he comes up with, which emphasizes the opacity by which that process of mutual recognition does not and does occur at the same time. And I kept thinking when I was looking at these transcriptions is that the opacity keeps coming to the fore in terms of not having a single formless vocabulary with which to sort of transparently encode these sounds. So then I was thinking, okay, well, if the opacity is there on the page in these transcriptions, do you need a kind of cosmopolitan horizon, a cosmopolitan set of desires that are at work in these transcriptions? Or is it, do you read them as implicated in a more conflictual politics of knowledge? I mean, it's probably something with both of them, it's not either or, but it's just more, I guess it's an invitation to ask about the question of cosmopolitanism now.
It's a great question, and these are big countries and there's a lot of people. Right? And they had newspapers that were very Republican, they had newspapers that were, translated into Arabic if the government wanted or whatever, and then they had, Revue and Jann. So there are a lot of people. But, music's an interesting place to look because, what's happening is subtle. It's not hit your overhead, violence and all that. One of the far-right groups in Algeria, which was much, much more complicated in this way because it's been a colony since 1830, whereas France it was 1934, when it came together. And basically in Algeria, this guy who turned century said, we really want a new Mediterranean race. We're making a new Mediterranean race, with all these people, because it wasn't just French, it was Spanish, Maltese, Italians, all the rest, And probably not relatives actually, because Sicilian is a lot of that name in Tunisia, so whatever. We're all kind of mixed up, as you say. And so this idea of kind of, justifying, if you want, the French presence through musical scales and all that is kind of like, I think they wanted to be the new Roman Empire, where it's kind of, the Mediterranean is kind of all of us, So I think cosmopolitan was really important. And for all the time Sanson spent there, which was like, 20 visits or 25 visits and all that, that Touchiat Zidane, which he got in 1873, is really, one of the main things he wrote Africa later. But he didn't really make a game of taking local tunes and doing something with it. He got past that about 1895. So the cosmopolitan became something kind of very different than, anyway. My paper tomorrow.
Yeah, but what happened with the French? Because now you can't even talk about race in France, and you can't even mention it. You're not supposed to talk about that.
Well, that's why we're Americans, because we can come in and stir things up. So, the problem in France is that there are 220 million people in the world who speak French, and only 60 million, live in France. So there's a lot of an openness to educating people, but not giving them jobs. So it's tricky. Yeah. Another topic.
Tricky. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow.